Darwin was brought up as a Unitarian Christian, and many Unitarians in the 19th century subscribed to beliefs that were at odds with the then teachings of the Church of England. They didn't, for example, believe in the infallibility of the Bible, the doctrine of original sin, or the Trinity, hence Unitarian. So Darwin grew up being used to questioning orthodoxies. And Darwin wasn't the first member of his family to speculate about the possibility that species evolved to give rise to new ones. Darwin's paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a medical doctor by trade, but a naturalist by inclination. His most famous writing was a book called Zoonomia, first published in 1794, in which he speculated about the possibility of organic evolution. Erasmus Darwin writes, "Would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, with the power of acquiring new parts attended with new propensities, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity, and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity?" This is, more or less, Lamarckian evolutionary theory before Lamarck got around to writing about it. The inheritance of characteristics acquired during the lifetime of the parent. Darwin's father, Robert, was also a doctor. So it was assumed that young Charles would follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps, and he was packed off aged 16 to Edinburgh, where he started to study medicine. Well, sort of. He didn't attend that many classes. Like his grandfather, his real enthusiasm turned out to be for natural history, and he joined, in his spare time, the Plinian Society, where he presented his first paper on marine invertebrates in 1827. However, it soon became apparent that medicine wasn't going to be Charles's real passion, and after 2 years, he moved to Cambridge to study theology, maths, and classics. So Plan B then, probably driven very much by his father, was for Darwin to become an Anglican priest. And Darwin wrote of his thinking at this time, "I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible. I soon persuaded myself that our creed must be fully accepted." He also read with great enthusiasm the writings of William Paley, in particular his book Evidences on the Existence and Attributes of the Deity from 1802. Now, Paley's argument was that the natural world has great complexity and apparent design, implying the existence of a designer, God. Famously, the analogy Paley uses is the pocket watch, lots of complex and intricately interrelated components, all of which have to be present in order for the whole to function, and that can only be assembled by an outside agency. Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, alludes to the difficulties in precisely this argument. Darwin, however, became a huge fan of Paley. He wrote that he could have written out the whole of the evidences with perfect correctness. The logic of this book, and, as I may add, of his natural theology, gave me as much delight as did Euclid. Natural theology was the school of thought that you could learn about the nature of the Creator by studying the natural world. While at Cambridge, Darwin was also tutored and strongly influenced by the natural theologian John Henslow. So Darwin was all set to take up a position as a country vicar when he graduated from Cambridge, and despite some reservations about precisely what he was required to believe, he wrote, "I liked the thought of being a country clergyman." But before leaving Cambridge, Henslow suggested to Darwin that he should first study some geology with Adam Sedgwick, who was responsible for the first detailed mapping of much of Wales. So Darwin and Sedgwick set off for 2 weeks in the field, and by the time they returned, Darwin's parish had fallen through. Henslow then introduced Darwin to Captain Robert Fitzroy, who was looking for a naturalist for the second voyage of the HMS Beagle. Darwin agreed and set off on the 27th of December 1831 on a voyage that was to last nearly 5 years. Fitzroy gave Darwin a copy of the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Lyell, much like Sedgwick, believed that the deity continually intervened through geological time in order to create new species. In particular, Lyell believed that these species appeared at particular points on the Earth that he referred to as centres of creation. So for much of the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin was trying in earnest to find Lyell's centres of creation. During the voyage, for the most part, Darwin maintained a very literal interpretation of Scripture. He afterwards wrote, "I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers, though themselves orthodox, for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality." It was only towards the end of the voyage in 1836 that the beginnings of his ideas about natural selection began to crystallise. And you have to bear in mind that it was going to be another 22 years before Darwin published anything about natural selection, and then only because his arm was forced. So in the intervening 22 years, Darwin came to question his beliefs more and more, but not principally because of his developing ideas about evolution. Firstly, he found the God of the Old Testament to be rather vengeful, jealous and angry, smiting and blasting this, that and the other. Secondly, because of his initially literal reading, he struggled with some apparent contradictions in Scripture. Perhaps the best known is the 2 creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, it takes 6 days, or periods, and it starts with watery chaos. Then there is light, dry land, plants, sea creatures, land animals, and right at the end, humans. In Genesis 2, the order is different, and it's not taking over 6 days. It starts with a desert-like oasis. Then man is created, then a garden with trees and a river, then land animals and birds, and finally woman. Now, theologians have read these accounts in a variety of ways, but right back to St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century, it's seldom been read literally. Indeed, St. Augustine warned specifically against a literal reading of Genesis. St. Augustine writes, "We should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance. The shame is not so much that an ignorant individual is derided, but that people outside the household of faith think our sacred writers held such opinions." Thirdly, Darwin is disturbed by the apparent wastefulness of nature and its indifference to apparent suffering, although he never became a cynic. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Some writers indeed are so much impressed by the amount of suffering in the world that they doubt, if we look to more sentient beings, whether there is more of misery or of happiness, whether the world is as a whole a good or a bad one. According to my judgment, happiness decidedly prevails." Fourthly, and perhaps most significantly, he and his wife Emma tragically lost their second child Annie to a combination of tuberculosis and scarlet fever in 1851, when she was just 10. This was a bitter blow from which Darwin never really recovered. Annie was his favourite child, probably because she showed him more spontaneous affection than her siblings, and the manner of her passing seemed especially cruel. After the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin was often asked about many things, including his religious beliefs. He does seem very much torn in two directions. In a letter to John Frederick William Herschel in 1861, he wrote, "One cannot look at this universe with all living productions and man without believing that all has been intelligently designed. Yet, when I look to each individual organism, I can see no evidence of this." And to Henry Ackland, "I am driven to two opposite conclusions. My theology is a simple muddle." Wind on 18 years towards the end of Darwin's life, and in a letter to John Fordyce, Darwin wrote, "It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. My judgment often fluctuates. Whether a man deserves to be called a theist depends on the definition of the term. In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. I think that generally, and more so as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. I think it's fair to say that some who would describe themselves as atheists admit to a remote possibility that there is a God. It's just that they consider the weight of evidence to be vastly loaded against it. I think it's also fair to say that this is a fairly fine distinction. It's also true that many scientists and evolutionary biologists are theists, albeit perhaps less than in the general population. The name of Theodosius Grigorovich Dobzhansky probably won't be familiar to many, but he was one of those responsible for the modern synthesis of neo-Darwinism in the 20th century. In many senses, this rescued Darwinism by combining it with the burgeoning science of genetics, and it made sense of things that really puzzled Darwin, like the fact that inheritance wasn't by the simple blending of traits from the parents. Dobzhansky should be much better known than he is because he said possibly the wisest thing said by anyone ever, which was this: nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Evolution really is the unifying theory in biology. It's the one fact that makes sense of all the other observations. But Dobzhansky was also an Orthodox Christian, who particularly warned against the dangers of a literal reading of many biblical texts, precisely the approach that Darwin took, at least up until the early 1840s. So whether or not you consider Darwin to have been an atheist depends to a great extent on how you define the term, although it's not a label that Darwin himself was ever particularly keen to own.